Hey there, it's Zoe Benson live from Miss Robichaux's Academy for Witches. You know, from the Covent season of American Horror Story. I hate to tell you all this, but me and the girls had to kill the VC Andrews critiquer. Papa Legba said if we offered him as a sacrifice, he'd release Marie and Misty from hell. You know, the voodoo lady and the swamp witch doctor. But then he made me another offer. If I sacrifice all of you to him, he will magically guarantee I'll be the next Supreme. And I liked that offer, so let's...
You are so full of shit! Or should I say dog's droppings? Sacrifice me to Papa Legba. Real witches do not make sacrifices, you liar. Scram, piss off, you have no place in my review. Get! Hey guys, it's the VC Andrews critiquer. So, now that I'm finally showing myself on screen for the first time, you're probably wondering why I'm a mouse. And the answer is, a witch did this to me. In hindsight, taking that candy bar from that lady in gloves on the street was probably not such a smart idea. And no, it was not that sorry excuse for a witch you just saw. Yeah, I, like most educated people, know that real witches aren't smoking hot girls striving to become the next supreme witch, or green-skinned hags in pointy hats after ruby slippers. Only Roald Dahl was able to describe what real witches are like in his 1983 book appropriately titled The Witches, and of course those of us who read it know that they're actually bald, toeless, blue-spitted demons whose goal is to eliminate all the children on Earth. And they almost succeeded when the the Grand High Witch, made a potion to turn all the kids on Earth into mice. But their plan backfired when a young boy who's the grandson of a retired witch hunter overheard this fiendish plot and didn't let being turned into a mouse stop him, and he and his grandma turned the tables by spiking their soup with the potion and turning all of them into mice. While it wasn't as iconic as Charlie and the Chocolate Factory or the BFG, The Witches was still a dull classic in its own right, and popular enough to spawn a film adaptation in 1990, starring Angelica Houston as the Grand High Witch. It wasn't a huge success at the box office, and Dahl wasn't too psyched about the happy ending they added, but pretty much everyone else loved the movie, and is often considered one of the best family-friendly horror films ever. But 30 years later, another adaptation was released, in the form of a graphic novel that made Bruno Jenkins a girl. And it's pretty well written, give it a look sometime. Oh, and there's another film adaptation that was released this year as well. What's interesting is that screenwriter Guillermo del Toro had been wanting to make this film for over 10 years, even planning to do it in stop motion. But then Robert Zemeckis stepped in to direct, and since his animated movie days are well behind him, for the better, the film became a mostly live-action interpretation, casting reasonably big names like Anne Hathaway as the Grand High Witch, Octavia Spencer as the grandmother, and Chris Rock as the voice of the protagonist grown up. As you might expect, people had mixed reactions to the news of this new adaptation. Some were excited to see the new directions a creative mind like Robert Zemeckis could take the story, while others felt the 1990 film was already a perfect adaptation and they were just messing up a classic. I personally didn't know what to expect going into this adaptation. Sure, the CGI was crap, but the names attached seemed promising, and the idea of a more faithful adaptation to the book spiked my interest, so I turned on HBOmax and... yeah, I was more than a little disappointed with what I got. Sure, it had some creative visuals and some concepts that were done even better than in the 1990 film, but on the whole, I didn't feel like Zemeckis and Del Toro tried very hard with adapting the story. And as for the promise to be more true to the book, well, we'll get to that a little later. But on the bright side, it does give me a lot of material to compare, so what do y'all say we take a look in the bubbling cauldron at my personal opinions of these two adaptations? This is old versus new, The Witches. Like most Roald Dahl stories, we've got some great characters we'll be looking at today, but first let's look at our bland lead that's kind of the trademark in Roald Dahl's works. This is Best Main Character. Yeah, one of the few downsides about Roald Dahl stories is that they very rarely had very interesting protagonists. Some could argue that this was so the reader could imagine themselves in their place, but if you like stories specifically for their leads, then Dahls are probably not for you. Hell, this story doesn't even give the main character a name. Well, the 1990 film does call him Luke, but yeah, neither incarnation really shows much of a character. He's got a few funny lines now and then, but he's mainly just the good-hearted everyman we often see take the lead in Roald Dahl stories. But I guess if I had to choose, I'd probably go with Luke. For one thing, they at least bothered to give him a name. But aside from that, Jason Fisher does give a slightly more memorable performance. Granted, he's definitely no Finn Wolfhard, but Fisher brings this corny little kid vibe in his line delivery that sometimes makes him seem more like a 7-year-old than a 10-year-old.
Grandma! Look! Oh, grandmas are great! I'm gonna build them a whole circus, teach them tricks and acrobatics and stuff. If you hurt my grandma... Silence!
But it really is very endearing and makes you care about Luke all the more. And don't get me wrong, Gisar Bruno gives a fine performance in the remake, especially in the beginning when he's grieving over the loss of his parents, but it's probably not going to leave a strong impression on you. Jason Fisher's performance is just cute enough that you remember it a little more. Plus, he has some pretty awesome moments in the movie, like when he exposes himself to the witches who are after him to save that baby's life. That took guts, kid. And scenes like him trying to steal the formula from the Grand High Witch's room, or running away from the hotel cooks when he's trying to spike the soup, do portray him in a bit more of a heroic manner than the new version. Although the scene in that film when he force-feeds the potion to the Grand High Witch is pretty awesome. While neither was an especially well-written character, Luke's endearing performance and few badass moments still make you really want to root for the character throughout the movie. Point goes to the old.
Is this you and your church friends trying to play a joke on me?
But even if Roald Dahl protagonists aren't that memorable, the good news is that their mentors usually are. From Willy Wonka, to the BFG, to the giant talking bugs, these are the characters that made Dahl stories the classics they are today. And as for this story, we'll be looking at Best Grandmother. One thing that pretty much everyone was looking forward to in this movie was Octavia Spencer as the grandmother, and let me just say, she does not disappoint with expectations. The grandmother is one of my favorite Roald Dahl characters ever. She's generally wise and loving, but also has a very blunt and cynical attitude in life from losing so many of her friends to witches, which sometimes hilariously screws over her attempts to be friendly. And Octavia Spencer really captures that in her performance. Like, look at the scenes when she's trying to comfort the main character when he's just lost his parents.
Don't feel like eating.
And I don't feel like wasting all this good food. What, you think I'm supposed to feel sorry for you? Well, I don't. Do I feel bad? Yeah, but not sorry.
You can tell that she means well, but it's really hard not to laugh at this miserably failed attempt to help her grandson cope with grief. But the good news is, when she does get being loving right, she really gets it right, and usually saves her cynical smartass attitude for those who truly deserve it. The only problem is that she doesn't get to do much of that in this version. More on that with Best Supporting Cast. The grandmother in the 1990 film, or Hilga as she's called there, is the one thing from the book that I feel the original film screwed up. She's still kind and wise and does stand up more to the jerks who deserve it in this version, but she doesn't seem to have that cynical sense of humor that made the grandmother such a great character, so these scenes don't feel quite as funny or empowering. She's portrayed more like a world-weary mystic, which isn't necessarily bad, but she just kind of feels like every other paranormal investigator we see in fiction. Octavia Spencer may have been a little young for the role, and little is kind of an understatement, but aside from that, she had everything that made the grandmother so memorable. The witch expertise, the lovable sarcastic attitude, and probably the wittiest lines in the whole film, and that gets my vote. Point goes to the new.
Loathsome, hideous, disgrace.
But you can't have a Roald Dahl story without some child-hating villains. Except maybe in Willy Wonka, and please emphasize maybe, and ours just happens to have the one who hates children more than any doll villain combined. This is the best Grand High Witch. Like a lot of other people, I initially thought this would be no contest. Anjelica Huston was perfect as the original Grand High Witch. She looked the part, well, in disguise anyway. She was funny and hammy, but also ruthless and intimidating, and she had one of the best costumes from the mind of Jim Henson. So naturally, I was expecting Huston to burn Anne Hathaway to a crisp in this role. But, to my pleasant surprise, Anne Hathaway did a surprisingly good job. Not only did she give a good over-the-top performance, but there were times when she scared me just as much as Huston did in the original. And I think this was the scene that sold it for me and a ton of other people.
We'll play the Shakespeare.
Another part of that may be because she has more superpowers that are shown on screen in this version. Like there's a scene in the new film where after the main kid becomes a mouse, he runs into a heat vent, but the witch doesn't let that stop her and uses her Mr. Fantastic arms to try and catch them. Yeah, the CGI is pretty bad, but this shows that 1. Being little and able to fit through small spaces isn't going to stop this woman from getting you, and 2. The witch here didn't stupidly assume that they'd just fall into a mousetrap on their own and was going to make sure they were dead right away. Kudos to you, Hathaway Witch. Kudos. Hell, by the time we saw her feet under the bed as she came in for the climax, my spine was actually shivering. Not much, but I still felt it. But is Hathaway better than Huston as the Grand High Witch? Well, she came close, but I'm still going to go with the original. My reasoning? Well, for one thing, look at the designs of the two. Huston looks like the lead witch in this coven, with those long claws, huge hump and nose, and also looks hundreds of years old. Hathaway had almost nothing to distinguish her as the leader of the other witches, except maybe that her grin was much bigger and scarier. Also, the Grand High Witch is supposed to be this crafty and stealthy villain who always makes absolutely sure she'll never be caught for her crimes.
Poison sweets. We'll wipe them out like weasels. And do not mind getting caught. Vilified.
Aside from trying to make sure the mice kids are dead in the meeting scene, Hathaway is anything but careful in this movie. Like, there's a scene where she asks Mr. Stringer, the manager, if he'd kill a mouse that was in his hotel, and when he says yes, she says to the other witches, "You'll hear that, girls? He'd eliminate those brats!"
Rats. We would exterminate the rats.
Or how about her literally ripping the stage off the ground to look for the kid? You think Mr. Stringer wouldn't question you about the stage being destroyed right after you had a conference in that room? Or how about leaving the Formula 86 bottles right in the open in your room? Come on, Hathaway, how careless can you be? It really does suck because Hathaway really did do well in this role. It's really just the lack of creativity in her design and carelessness as a villain that holds her back. But yeah, those are very big setbacks. But I think what gives Huston the final upper hand in this comparison is that her performance has a bit more of a domineering edge. Like, compare the scenes where she burns a witch alive just for saying she didn't think they could kill every child in England. In the original, she was absolutely infuriated that this witch dared to show even a little insubordination, and you could really see the sadism she got from frying her alive. In the new film, she's like, that wasn't nice. Sorry, Hathaway, you did a lot better than I was expecting, but Anjelica Huston is still the grandest Grand High Witch. Point goes to the old. Well, we've looked at our Roald Dahl lead, mentor, and villain, but how do Dahl side characters usually fare? They're fun, I suppose. Not amazing, but still worth a look. So let's take a look with Best Supporting Cast. I guess we should start with Bruno Jenkins, the fat kid whose lack of stranger smarts gets him mouseified and roped into the story. and both versions are really pretty good. The one in the original book is an unlikable jerk who does virtually nothing but stuff his face. But both adaptations portray him more like a dim-witted glutton who's a bit mouthy but still pretty good-hearted and helpful, so he ends up being a lot more likable. So it's kind of a tie for me. Although my personal favorite version of Bruno is the female one from the graphic novel, but we're not comparing her unfortunately. Then there's the new character added to the Zemeckis version, Mary, the main character's pet mouse who turns out to be another transformed child. While I do feel like there's more they could have done with this character, I really do like the basic idea, and she does have a few funny lines. But unfortunately, the rest of the supporting cast is pretty disappointing in the new version, especially the hotel manager, Mr. Stringer. Sure, Stanley Tucci's portrayal as a courteous gentleman is fine, but it's still no match for Rowan Atkinson's portrayal as a cynical tight-ass who hates children and animals. Because 1, there's a lot more material you can get from a character like this, and 2, it makes sense that the witches would have their annual meeting in a hotel run by someone who has similar views to them. The new film also drops the airheaded cleaning lady, which is really too bad because she was such a funny character. Bruno's parents are okay in the Zemeckis film, but they're barely in it. Even their reaction to seeing their son as a mouse, one of the most memorable scenes in the original, is quickly glanced over. How about the other witches? Again, no contest at all. There are so many of them that I remember in the original. Like the wimpy one who pays the price of implying insubordination, the smug one who watches the door during the meeting and sniffs out Luke, and of course, the Grand High Witch's bubbly sidekick, Miss Irving, who eventually gets fed up with being treated like dog's droppings and turns Luke and Bruno back to normal in the end. And let's not forget all the background witches who were played by bald guys in a drag. In the new film, the only witch who does anything is the one who tries to get the main character in the beginning, and let's look at the two back to back. In the original, she was still creepy, but you could tell she was making a genuine effort to appear sweet and harmless to Luke, and only slowly starts to show her true colors when the sweet approach doesn't work. In the new film, I don't feel like she even tries to seem harmless. I mean, seriously, if you were a little kid, would you come within 5 feet of this lady?
Do you like sweet? She is tame.
Even though the Zemeckis film does a good job with the most prominent side character and has a decent new one as well, the rest of the supporting cast is such a letdown it does not deserve the point on this round. Point goes to the old.
Crikey!
Now to get to the meat in all this, the story, which had the best scares, pacing, understanding of the source material, and just overall better entertainment. This is Best Story. When I first saw the trailers for the movie, I had no idea what I was going to get from this new Witches adaptation. I had read interviews from the filmmakers that it would be closer to the book than the 1990 film, but I raised an eyebrow at that, seeing how the original was already quite a faithful adaptation. And the trailers made it seem like there were a variety of new directions it was going to take, like fleshing out the relationship between the grandmother and the Grand High Witch, exploring more the perspective of being a mouse, and also adding a new atmosphere with the 1960s Alabama setting. But either way, I was optimistic I'd appreciate the movie for what it was when I saw it. But like said before, I wasn't too psyched with the final product, and I think the story is probably where the biggest issues lie. Is it a closer adaptation of the original book like Zemeckis and Del Toro promised? No, not really. Well, I take it back. There are actually two big things done better in the book that the Zemeckis film restores. One is the death of the kid's parents. Like in the book, the kid here was part of the car crash that killed his mom and dad, but was lucky to survive. As you can imagine, this makes it much more traumatizing as he actually had to see his parents die right in front of him and almost lost his own life as well. In the original, they just go off for a drive one night, Luke finds they never came home, and then the police come and say, sorry, they're dead. I'm sure they were going for a less is more drive here, but less is just less in this case. And the second is the ending. I was so glad that the Zemeckis film restored the ending where the main character stays a mouse forever, because it went better with the more grim tone of the story, and it was kind of heartwarming to see him and his grandmother glad they would die together due to the shorter lifespan of mice. I didn't completely loathe the happy ending like Roald Dahl did, but I was kind of disappointed. But other than that, the 1990 adaptation is clearly the one that better understands the source material. It knows the story is dark and creepy, and it embraces it head on. Like, let's look at the stories about the grandmother's childhood friends hexed by witches each one takes from the book. The original takes the one about the girl being trapped in the painting because it knew it was the most creepy and dramatic one. And it was perfectly done. The girl gets grabbed while walking through a dark alley, the police can't find her, her parents are trying to cope, and then her father freaks to see his daughter locked in the painting calling out to him. The new film uses the story about the girl being turned into a chicken, and to be fair, this could have been effectively scary if done right, and that's how it seemed at first, but it quickly went in a completely comedic direction and any feeling of uncomfortableness went right out the coop. Another part of why the scares aren't as effective is because the story isn't structured very well. Like in this version, the main character meets the witch who tries to offer him the snake before he learns all about witches from his grandmother. Sure, that lady is insanely creepy, but without knowing all about these demons yet, it doesn't leave quite the shock towards him and those who aren't familiar with the story. Or in the original film, the grandmother goes with Luke to the seaside hotel to help with her diabetes, adding another dark edge to the already dark story. In the new film, they just go to get away from the witch living in their neighborhood, even though it's already made pretty clear that witches live in almost every community on Earth, so moving away won't make much difference. And the whole illness is dropped aside from this recurring cough that's never explained. But how about the new directions it takes? Well, the more fleshed out past between the grandma and the GHW is done pretty well and makes for a much better climax. But what does the 60s Alabama setting offer? Honestly, not too much. There's almost no difference in style or atmosphere with the story, so what was even the point? Even the mouse perspective angle isn't explored that much. Sure, what we get is pretty cool, but don't expect too much of that. The movie just feels like it was written in too much of a rush. While other new doll adaptations weren't great, you could tell the screenwriters actually took the time to explore the new ideas and angles it offered. This one feels like it just came up with a few new ideas on paper and barely touched upon them, and also made other changes to the plot that only hampered the grim atmosphere instead of strengthened it. And that's too bad, because I really did think it was going to be an amazing film. Is it horrible? No, but it's still probably the weakest adaptation of a doll story I've seen. It's not especially faithful to the book, but it's not unique enough to feel like its own special take on it. It may have greatly improved a few things and had great performances from Hathaway and Spencer, but that's not enough to outweigh the more faithful and creepy adaptation that's been scaring kids for over 30 years. Point goes to the superior film.
I can't stand it! It's so wonderful! Look at you! It's fantastic!
And that's all I got. Sorry I couldn't get this out before Halloween, but the day after is the next best thing. Now if you all will excuse me, I have to find Miss Irving to turn me back into a human. So I'll be... Huh? Papa Legba! You know I was just kidding around about you not being real, right? You and those teen witches have great magical powers and... what are you doing? No. Put that down. No, we can talk about...